I'm going to read you a couple of things out of the, I mentioned to you this little book on Chaplins and Grizzard. And I would recommend, it hadn't come in yet, but I would recommend that you check it out in the library. In the Civil War, when the Civil War first broke out, most of the chaplains entered service not because they were compassionate, not because they cared. It was a position, it was a place of glory, and most of them in the very beginning of the war, they were just ruthless individuals that soldiers grew to care absolutely nothing whatsoever about. They were wicked men. They were playing cards with the men, getting drunk with the men, carousing with the men. They were not men of God, most of them. But that's not what the army wanted. Or that's not what the soldiers wanted. And there were some good men. And one of those good men was a man by the name of J. William Jones. And he was a Baptist chaplain. And as men started getting disgusted with those chaplains that had come to seek all of the glory and all of that business, and they started not having anything to do with them and the good chaplains that were around, here's an article that J. William Jones wrote, and he was part of the 13th Virginia Regiment, and he wrote this, and they published it in the Religious Herald, and it was a cry for men in the chaplaincy. And here's what he said. Send us the names of good men, and I here repeat, we want none others. Our object being not merely to fill up the regiments with nominal chaplains, but to fill the vacancies with efficient working men. We want effective gospel preachers whose burden shall be Christ and Him crucified. It is a common mistake that anybody will do to preach to soldiers. And hence the chaplaincies are generally filled by young and inexperienced men. But a moment's reflection will suffice to convince that since we have in the army the flower of the country, he's talking about all of the young men that are making up the soldiers, we ought to have the best preaching talent of the country. I call upon our city and country pastors earnestly to consider whether it is not their duty to enter this wide field of usefulness. It is a field worthy the attention of our most experienced, most useful ministers, and if they cannot get their consent to enter regularly upon it, I call upon them to at least give us occasional visits. We want men who will stick to their posts. And those words were italicized. I am persuaded that a great deal of harm has been done by chaplains resigning or absenting themselves for long periods from their commands on, and this is noted, detail to collect clothing, or some such pretext. The great business of the chaplain is to preach Christ publicly and from tent to tent. And the temporal welfare of the soldiers should be made subordinate to this. We want men physically able as well as willing to endure hardships and privations. If a chaplain would live up to the full measure of his usefulness, he must be with his regiment on the weary march, frequently resigning his horse to some footsore soldier. Lie with them around the bivouac fire after evening prayers are over. Be drenched on the outpost or face the pelting snowstorm. Divide with some hungry soldier his last hard cracker, and in a word, share with his regiment whatever hardships they may be called on to endeavor. Now, if a brother is physically unable to endure these hardships, he had best not enter the work. But there is no question that many a delicate brother would have his health permanently improved if he would thus learn to endure hardness as a good soldier. This one. General Jeb Stuart was quoted as stating emphatically in these words his desire for a chaplain. I I do not want a man who is not both able and willing to endure hardness as a good soldier. The man who cannot endure the fatigues, hardships, and privations of our rough riding and hard service and be in place when needed would be of no earthly use to us and is not wanted at my headquarters. This sentiment is well understood and appreciated by every officer of the line today, back during the Civil War. Wow. One chaplain made this statement as I was reading, that more than not, it seemed as though they were in camp meeting than they were on the battlefield. And that's because that God was sending revival to the southern states as well as the northern states. As you read history, friend, you find out that, look, those men would get saved and they wanted to be baptized, and quite often those baptismal services took place with the southern army on this side of the river and the northern army on this side of the river, and it was never accounted, friend. Look, whenever they'd have a baptizing service, the enemy, the opposing enemy, they'd never fire a shot, and many times they'd even come to the riverbank and they'd sing on the other side of the shore while the preaching was taking place and while the candidates were being baptized. Friend, the war came to an end for that period of time.
Amen.
God moved and God blessed through hardships.